The skies over the Pan-Pacific bloc burned with the color of bruised meat as the last fortress of the Ethnarchy crumbled under orbital bombardment. 3 legions of Thunder Warriors died in the mud to secure the approach vector. Their biological enhancements were failing. They roared in madness as their organs ruptured from the stress of combat. It was a victory, but it was messy. It was inefficient. In the Strategium, deep beneath the Himalayas, the Emperor of Mankind looked at the casualty reports. The numbers were scrolling on a cogitator screen that spanned an entire wall. He did not blink. The radiation counters outside clicked like furious insects. Terror was a graveyard of techno-barbarians and forgotten empires. The Emperor knew the Great Crusade would require more than just brute strength. He needed perfection. He felt the warp pressing against the edges of reality. The Chaos Gods were watching him. They were waiting for him to overextend. He felt the familiar cold pressure of the Imperium, trying to find a crack in his psychic armor. A sudden silence fell over the command bunker. It was not a silence of sound, but of psychic weight. The Emperor turned. His custodian guard raised their guardian spears in a single fluid motion. They were the perfect warriors. They never missed. They struck with the speed of lightning. Yet their blades hit nothing but air. A tall, slender figure stood in the center of the room. He wore robes of a strange alien silk that did not catch the dust of the bunker. His skin was pale blue. He held a staff with a floating black ring. He did not look like a demon. He did not feel like a Xenos threat the Emperor had catalogued. He felt like the absence of conflict. The custodians attacked again. Valdor, the Captain General, thrust his spear with force enough to pierce a tank. The figure simply shifted his neck 1 inch to the left. The spear passed harmlessly. The figure did not sweat. He did not exert himself. He took a bite of a synthetic nutrient bar he had plucked from a nearby supply crate. The Emperor signaled his guards to stand down. The golden giants froze, though their muscles remained coiled and ready to snap. The Emperor looked at the stranger. He saw no malice. He saw a depth of power that made the psychic roar of the warp look like a candle flame against a sun. The stranger spoke. His voice was calm. It sounded like a bell ringing in a quiet valley. He told the Emperor that his movements were wasted. He said the Emperor fought with too much tension. He said the Master of Mankind was trying to force the galaxy to obey him, rather than moving through the galaxy as water moves through a riverbed. The stranger introduced himself only as an attendant. He said he was looking for a candidate who could learn to master the self, rather than master others. The Emperor calculated the strategic value of this offer. He saw the future paths stretching out before him. In most of them, his empire burned. In most of them, his sons turned against him. In most of them, he ended up a corpse on a golden throne. He looked at the blue-skinned stranger. He looked at the impossible speed that was not speed, but simply being in the right place before the blow arrived. The Emperor realized that his reliance on raw psychic might was a vulnerability. It was a beacon that drew the predators of the warp. He needed a new doctrine. He needed to fight without thinking. He needed his body to react before his mind could doubt. The Emperor stepped down from the command dais. He placed his sword on the table. He nodded to the stranger. The timeline fractured in that silent moment. The path to the stars would no longer be paved only with bolter fire. It would be paved with a terrible, quiet precision. The lesson began. The training chamber was a hollowed-out cavern beneath the crust of the Himalaya. The air was recycled and smelled of ozone and crushed rock. The Emperor of Mankind stood in the center of the circle. He was breathing hard. This was a physical action he had not performed out of necessity for 1,000 years. Sweat beaded on his forehead. It was not the sweat of exertion. It was the sweat of mental strain. He was trying to stop thinking. Across from him stood the attendant, Whis. The pale being held a small wooden stick. It was a simple branch from a withered tree, the only organic thing in the room besides the two figures. The Emperor lunged. He moved faster than a bolt shell. His sword was a blur of golden light. He aimed for the attendant's neck. The blow would have severed the head of a titan. Whis did not parry. He did not block. He simply ceased to be in the path of the blade. He stepped forward. The movement was so subtle it looked like he was standing on a sliding floor. He tapped the Emperor on the forehead with the wooden stick. The sound was a sharp crack. The Emperor recoiled. His golden armor hummed with frustrated psychic energy. The blow had not hurt him physically. It had hurt his pride. It had shattered his concentration. The Emperor lowered his sword. He looked at the attendant. Whis was eating a piece of fruit. It was a shriveled apple from a hydroponic garden in the Nordmerica dust bowls. Whis chewed thoughtfully. He swallowed and pointed the stick at the master of mankind. He said the Emperor was too loud. He said the Emperor screamed his intentions to the universe before he even moved a muscle. Malcador, the sigillite, watched from the observation deck behind armored glass. His hands gripped his staff until his knuckles were white. He was terrified. He was the second most powerful psyker in the human species. He could crush minds across a continent, yet he could not read the attendant. When Malcador looked at Whis with his witch sight, he saw nothing. He saw a void. It was not the hungry void of the warp. It was a peaceful void. It was the absence of data. Malcador feared this creature was a trick of the Chaos Gods. He feared it was a Xenos weapon sent to assassinate the Emperor before the Great Crusade could begin. He had advised the Emperor to destroy the alien. The Emperor had refused. The Emperor had seen the logic in the stranger's words. The Emperor knew that the warp was reacting to him. The stronger he became, the stronger his shadows in the Imperium grew. The attendant offered a way to sever that link, and the Emperor deactivated his power sword. The matter disruption field died with a hiss. He asked Whis how to stop the mind. The Emperor explained that his mind was holding the tectonic plates of terror together. His mind was guiding the navigation of ships in the void. His mind was calculating the genetic code of the 20 suns growing in the laboratories. He could not stop thinking. If he stopped thinking, the Imperium would collapse before it began. Whis shook his head. He finished the apple and tossed the core into a waste reclamation bin. He explained that the Emperor was confusing awareness with focus. He said the body must know what to do without the mind telling it. The mind must be free to handle the macro scale, while the body handles the micro scale. Whis called it a state of self-movement. He said the Emperor was a slave to his own foresight. Because the Emperor constantly looked at the future, he was never truly present in the moment. This lag was why the stick hit his forehead. The training cycle ended for the day. The Emperor walked to the changing chambers. Servitors approached to remove his golden plating. The machinery of the Imperium was grinding into motion around them. In the hallway, a scribe named Caleb sat at a small metal desk. Caleb was 40 years old, but looked 60. His skin was grey from a lack of sunlight. He had lesions on his hands from handling toxic parchment. He was eating a ration bar made of recycled starch and corpse protein. It tasted like chalk. Caleb did not look up as the Emperor passed. To look at the Emperor was to risk blindness. Caleb just kept writing logistical reports. The reports detailed the grain shipments for the Thunder Warriors. The numbers were bad. The legions were eating more than the agridomes could produce. Caleb noted that the atmospheric scrubbers in the Unity hab blocks were failing. People were coughing up blood. The price of unity was high. Caleb shivered as the draft from the corridor hit him. He wrapped his thin robe tighter. He was a cog. He knew he would die at this desk. The Emperor entered the strategy room. Malcador was waiting. The sigillite projected a holographic map of terror. One red blotch remained. The Ethnarchy of the Caucasus. They were a genetic cult of tyrant kings who used enslaved psychers to power their void shields. They were dug into the mountains. The Thunder Warriors had assaulted their walls for 3 weeks. Casualties were 40%. The Thunder Warriors were breaking down. Their minds were snapping. They were slaughtering civilians in fits of rage. Malcador pointed to the map. He said the 4th Legion of Thunder Warriors was combat ineffective. They needed the Custodes to intervene. The Emperor looked at the map. He looked at his hands. He felt the phantom tap of the wooden stick on his forehead. He realized he had been fighting the Ethnarchy with brute force. He had been trying to smash the rock. He decided to apply the lesson. He ordered the Thunder Warriors to withdraw. Malcador protested. To withdraw was to show weakness. The Ethnarchy would claim victory. The morale of the unified zones would crumble. The Emperor raised a hand. He did not speak with the psychic voice that forced obedience. He spoke with a quiet, normal voice. He said the Thunder Warriors were a hammer. He no longer needed a hammer. He needed a needle. He ordered Valdor to prepare a single gunship. He would go alone. He would take the attendant with him. Malcador gasped. He said this was madness. The Emperor ignored him. He went to the armory. He did not put on the golden auramite plate that shone like a star. He put on a simple bodysuit of black fiber weave. It offered no protection against bolters. It offered maximum mobility. He took a single sword. The gunship flew low over the radwastes. The wind howled against the hull. Inside, Whis sat calmly. He was holding a container of noodles he had requested from the palace kitchens. The noodles were soggy. The broth was flavorless. Whis ate them anyway. He told the Emperor that the flavor was nostalgic. The Emperor stood by the open ramp. He watched the ground rush by. He saw the ruins of the old world. He saw the skeletons of skyscrapers and the craters of atomic wars. He closed his eyes. He stopped looking for the enemy's timeline. He stopped trying to predict where the anti-air fire would come from. He just stood. The gunship crossed the perimeter of the Ethnarchy's fortress. Flak cannons opened fire. The sky filled with exploding shells. The pilot screamed that they were locked on. The Emperor did not issue a command. He simply stepped out of the moving gunship. He fell through the air. The wind tore at his black suit. A flak shell exploded near him. Shrapnel flew at his face. He did not shield himself telekinetically. He tilted his head. The hot metal missed his eye by a millimeter. He landed on the snowy peak of the mountain, right above the fortress main gate. He did not make a crater when he landed. He landed softly, like a feather settling on the ground. The snow did not even shift under his boots. The Ethnarchy guard saw him. They were gene-bulked ogres carrying rotary cannons. They opened fire. The Emperor walked forward. He did not run. The bullets carved up the air around him. He moved through the storm of lead. He shifted his shoulder to let a round pass. He lifted his foot to let a grenade roll under him. He was efficient. Every movement had a purpose. There was no wasted energy. He reached the first guard. The guard swung a massive chain axe. The Emperor stepped inside the guard's reach. He placed 2 fingers on the guard's chest. He applied a precise kinetic pulse. It was not a psychic blast. It was biology. He struck the nerve cluster that controlled the heart. The guard dropped dead instantly. The Emperor moved to the next. He did not swing his sword. He used the enemy's momentum against them. He guided their attacks into each other. The ogres killed each other in their confusion. Deep inside the mountain, the Ethnarch watched on a monitor. He was a creature of twisted flesh and machinery. He screamed at his psykers to crush the intruder. The psykers linked their minds. They cast a spell of doom. They summoned a firestorm to incinerate the peak. The fire roared down. The Emperor felt the heat. Normally, he would have fought the fire with his own psychic golden fire. He would have engaged in a battle of wills. This time he did nothing. He suppressed his presence. He made his soul small. He became a stone. The psychic firestorm searched for a target. It searched for an ego to latch onto. It found nothing. The fire washed over the mountain and dissipated. The Emperor walked through the smoke, untouched. He was invisible to the aggression of the warp because he offered no aggression in return. He reached the throne room. The Ethnarch activated his personal void shields. He aimed a plasma pistol at the Emperor. The Emperor did not slow down. The Ethnarch fired. The sun-hot plasma bolt flew true. The Emperor pivoted on his heel. The plasma burned the air where his chest had been a microsecond before. The Emperor was now standing in front of the Ethnarch. He looked at the shimmering void shield. He did not batter it. He did not overload it. He looked for the frequency. He sensed the vibration of the generator. He tapped the shield generator with the pommel of his sword. He struck the exact point of resonance. The generator shattered. The shield collapsed. The Ethnarch stared in horror. He asked what manner of god stood before him. The Emperor did not answer. He delivered a single chop to the Ethnarch's neck. The tyrant fell. The war was over. The return to the palace was quiet. The Emperor walked into the strategy room. He threw the head of the Ethnarch onto the table. Malkador looked at the head. He looked at the Emperor's black suit. There was not a single scratch on it. There was no blood. The Emperor sat down. He looked tired, but it was a good tired. It was the fatigue of a muscle used correctly for the first time. Whis floated in. He asked if there was any dessert. Malkador signaled a servant to bring a tray of synthetic jellies. Whis seemed pleased. The Emperor spoke to Malkador. He said the Thunder Warriors were done. They could not fight this way. They were too angry. They were too reliant on adrenaline and chemical rage. He needed a new legion. He needed warriors who could find the quiet place inside the storm. This decision changed the timeline of the Astartes project. The Emperor went to the genetic laboratories deep beneath the dungeons. The 20 gestation capsules of the Primarchs were humming with life. The Emperor looked at the data slates. He had designed them to be aspects of his own glory. He had designed them to be conquerors. He looked at the template for the 11th Primarch. He deleted the aggression subroutines. He looked at the template for the 12th Primarch, the one who would have been Angron. He saw the potential for empathy. He saw the potential for a healer who could take the pain of others. He reinforced those genes. He removed the sequences that would make the Primarch vulnerable to the butcher's nails. He adjusted the template for the 15th Primarch, Magnus. He saw the immense psychic potential. He added a genetic dampener. It would limit Magnus's raw power output, but increase his control. He wanted Magnus to learn the lesson of the empty hand, not the lesson of the sun. Whis watched from the doorway. He warned the Emperor that tinkering with fate had consequences. The Chaos Gods were already moving. They could smell the change. They knew the Emperor was becoming something they could not easily corrupt. A corruption requires a handle. It requires pride, or fear, or rage. If the Emperor removed those handles from his sons, the gods would be desperate. The Emperor nodded. He said let them come. He worked for weeks without sleep. He refined the gene seed. The Space Marines would not just be shock troops. They would be warrior monks. They would be taught to meditate before they learned to shoot. They would be taught that the bolt gun is an extension of the will, and the will must be silent. The crisis struck 6 months later. It was the event history would call the scattering. The Emperor was in the lab. He was performing the final nutrient exchange for the Primarch tanks. The Geller field generators flickered. The air turned cold. Frost formed on the glass of the tanks. A rift in reality tore open in the ceiling of the chamber. A vortex of screaming faces descended. The Chaos Gods had united. They reached for the infants. Malkador burst into the room, his staff blazing with power. He shouted for the Emperor to use his psychic might to banish the demons. The Emperor raised his hands. He felt the infinite malice of the four. Khorne roared for blood. Nurgle reached with rotting hands. Tzeentch wove intricate crystal prisons. Slaanesh whispered promises of perfection. The Emperor's instinct was to blast them. He wanted to unleash the anathema. But he remembered the training. If he pushed back with force, he would shatter the tanks. The psychic backlash would kill the infants. He had to be water. He had to flow around the attack. He dropped his psychic shields. He let the warp energy flood the room. Malkador screamed as the pressure hit him. The Emperor stood in the center of the vortex. He did not fight the gods. He accepted their presence. He grabbed the tanks telekinetically. He did not pull them against the suction. He rode the current. The tanks were sucked into the warp. The Emperor did not panic. He placed a psychic marker on each one, a silent, invisible tag. He let them go. The vortex closed. The room was silent. The tanks were gone. Malkador fell to his knees weeping. He said all was lost. The great work was ruined. The suns were gone. The Emperor stood still. He was breathing rhythmically. He turned to Whis, who was standing in the corner, unbothered by the metaphysical apocalypse. Whis asked if the Emperor had lost them. The Emperor shook his head. He said he had not lost them. He had allowed them to be deployed. He explained that by not fighting the abduction, he had saved their souls from immediate corruption. If he had fought, the gods would have scarred the infants to spite him. By letting them go, the gods were confused. The gods thought they had won a victory, but they had merely scattered the seeds. The Emperor walked to the main console. He began to plan the Great Crusade. It would be a rescue mission, but the legions he built would be different. He looked at the gene seed stocks that remained. He had the genetic codes. He could still build the armies. He ordered the scribe Caleb to send a message to the weaponsmiths of Mars. He needed bolters, but he also needed training blades. He needed meditation gardens built on the battle barges. The first recruits were chosen from the survivors of the Ethnarchy Wars. They were children who had seen too much death. The Emperor spoke to them. He did not promise them glory. He promised them silence. He promised them that they would learn to master the beast inside. The first legion to be fully formed was the first, the Dark Angels. In this timeline, they were not Knights of Secrets. They were the practitioners of the Void Strike. The Emperor taught their master, a surrogate commander, until the lion could be found, the art of the decisive cut. The Astartes learned to fight in total silence. No war cries, no shouting orders. They communicated with micro-bead clicks and hand signals. A battlefield involving the First Legion was unnaturally quiet. The enemy would hear nothing but the wet thud of bolters and the hum of power armor. This silence was terrifying. It broke the morale of human rebels faster than any terror tactic. Meanwhile, the bureaucracy of terror expanded. The Senatorum Imperialis was formed. The Emperor attended the first meeting. The High Lords were arguing about tax tithes and planetary governors. They were shouting over each other. The Emperor sat at the head of the table. He did not speak. He let them shout. He waited until they ran out of breath. He waited until the silence became awkward. He waited until they looked at him in fear. Then he spoke. He told them that the Imperium was a body. If the liver fights the stomach, the body dies. He reorganized the administration in an hour. He simplified the tax code. He removed redundant departments. He applied the principle of efficiency to government. It was ruthless. Thousands of bureaucrats lost their jobs. They were repurposed into the agri-gangs. Efficiency had a human cost. Whis spent his time exploring the palace. He found the libraries. He read the history of old Earth. He seemed fascinated by the concept of fiction. He told the Emperor that humans were interesting because they invented problems just to solve them. One day, Whis came to the Emperor with a concern. He said that while the Emperor was learning to master his own body, his empire was growing a soul of its own, a collective soul, and that soul was hungry. The Emperor looked at the reports from the first expeditionary fleets. They were encountering Xenos species, the Rangdan, the Orcs. The response of the Imperial fleets was becoming efficient, but it was cold. There was no passion. There was only the calculation of extermination. The Emperor realized the danger. If his Astartes felt nothing, they would lose their humanity. They would become biological robots. He needed to teach them balance. He needed them to feel, but not be controlled by feeling. He established the Remembrancer Order much earlier. But these were not just artists. They were philosophers. They were attached to the squads to teach the Astartes poetry and logic. They were there to remind the killers that they were killing for a reason. The Emperor stood on the bridge of the Bucephalus. The ship was a golden spear aimed at the stars. Beside him stood Valdor and Malcador. Whis was seated in a command chair he had dragged onto the bridge, eating a bowl of rice. The stars were cold and distant. The Emperor looked out at the galaxy. He could feel his sons out there. He could feel the lion on a forest world, hunting beasts. He could feel Fulgrim on a dying industrial rock, trying to create beauty. He could feel the Wolf King on the ice. He reached out to them, not with a shout, but with a whisper. He sent a psychic signal that was not a command, but a beacon. A simple pulse that said, "Wait, I am coming." The fleet jumped into the warp. The Geller fields held. The transit was smooth. The navigators reported that the currents seemed to part around the Emperor's ship. He was not fighting the tide. He was sailing it. The Great Crusade had begun, not as a storm of conquest, but as a surgical procedure to heal a fractured galaxy. But in the depths of the warp, the Chaos Gods were not idle. They had realized that the anathema had changed rules. Khorne stopped roaring. He began to sharpen his axe. If the Emperor would not fight with rage, Khorne would have to teach him that some things can only be destroyed by anger. The Blood God turned his gaze to the gladiator pits of Nuceria, where a child named Angron was just learning to kill. Khorne smiled. He would make the boy a hammer that no amount of water could stop. The final image of the era was the scribe Caleb. He died at his desk of heart failure. His head fell onto the parchment. The ink pooled around his cheek. A servitor unit came to collect the body. It was recycled into protein rations. The bureaucracy continued. The machine did not stop. The Emperor's efficiency had saved the Imperium from chaos, but it had not saved Caleb. The silence of the grave was the ultimate stability, and the galaxy was very, very large. There were many graves yet to dig. The Emperor knew this. He accepted it. He took a bite of an apple Whis offered him. It was bitter. He ate it anyway. The work continues. The crusade moved outward like a ripple in a dark pond. 10 years had passed since the launch. The Imperium of mankind was expanding, but it was a strange expansion. The fleets did not conquer with fire and thunder. They conquered with the terrifying inevitability of a rising tide. The 12th Expeditionary Fleet hung in the void above the world of Nuceria. The planet was a sphere of grey dust and red oceans. It was a civilized world, technically. It possessed technology. It possessed hierarchy. It possessed slavery. The sensor arrays of the flagship Adamant Resolve picked up the electromagnetic chatter of the surface. It was a noise of commerce and brutality. The ruling caste, the High Riders, broadcast their arena games to the populace. They used cortical implants to force gladiators into states of hyperaggression. It was efficient entertainment. It kept the population distracted. On the bridge of the Adamant Resolve, Ibram Greer, Legion Master of the Warhounds, studied the tactical plot. He was a block of muscle and scar tissue. His armor was white and blue, unpainted by the blood of enemies because the Warhounds had learned the Emperor's new doctrine. They killed quickly. They killed cleanly. They did not revel in the spray of arteries. But Greer felt a tension in his gut. The augurs had detected a genetic anomaly on the surface. It was a signal that matched the Emperor's own biological frequency. It was a Primarch, the Tutitund, the genetic father of the Warhounds. Greer looked at his hands. They were trembling slightly. He wanted to meet his sire. He wanted to see the perfection of the gene line. The Emperor stood by the viewport. He was not wearing his golden armor. He wore a simple grey tunic and trousers. He looked like a crewman, save for the fact that the light in the room seemed to bend around him. He was watching Nuceria. He felt the pain radiating from the planet. He felt the psychic scream of a mutilated soul. Whis stood nearby, examining a data slate about the local weather patterns. Whis remarked that the planet had high sulfur content in the atmosphere. He said it would smell like rotten eggs. The Emperor did not smile. He told Greer to prepare a dropship. The Emperor would go alone. Greer protested. He said the planet was hostile. The High Riders were arrogant. They had fired warning shots at the fleet's atmospheric probes. The Emperor raised a hand. He said hostility was just energy. Energy could be redirected. The dropship descended through the sulfur clouds. Turbulence shook the hull. The pilot, a void-born woman named Janna, struggled with the controls. The Emperor placed a hand on the console. He did not use psychic force. He simply pointed to a specific dial. He told her the fuel mixture was running rich. He told her to adjust the intake valve by 3%. She did. The shaking stopped. The ship glided. They landed in the Deschia Mountains. The air was thin and cold. Below them, on a high ridge, a ragged army was making its last stand. These were the eaters of cities, escaped slaves, gladiators. They were starving. They were wounded. They were surrounded by 5 armies of the High Riders. The Emperor walked down the ramp. The wind whipped his grey hair. He did not carry a weapon. He did not carry a shield. He walked up the slope toward the gladiator lines. The slaves saw him. They raised their rusted weapons. They saw a man who looked like a healthy, well-fed off-worlder. They hated him instantly. To them, he was just another High Rider. A giant figure pushed through the ranks of the slaves. It was Angron. The Primarch was covered in dried blood and fresh mud. Cables pulsed in his skull. The butcher's nails. They were ancient archaeotech devices hammered into his brain cortex. They replaced his capacity for peace with a chemical need for violence. Angron roared. It was a sound of absolute misery. He charged the Emperor. He wielded a broken chain axe. The teeth of the weapon spun with a grinding shriek. The Emperor did not assume a combat stance. He stood with his arms loose at his sides. He watched Angron's muscles bunch. He watched the shift in weight. Angron swung the axe. It was a blow that would have cleaved a tank. The Emperor stepped forward. He moved inside the arc of the swing. He was so close he could smell the infection in Angron's scalp. He placed a hand on Angron's chest. In the standard timeline, the Emperor would have used his psychic might to stun the Primar. He would have frozen him with a thought. But this Emperor was guided by the doctrine of the flow. He did not want to force his son into submission. He wanted to flow with his son's energy and guide it to stillness. He tried to synchronize his psychic wavelength with Angron's mind. He tried to share the lesson of the empty void. He tried to project the feeling of calm water. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The butcher's nails were not biological. They were machines designed to punish calm. When the Emperor projected his wave of tranquility into Angron's mind, the nails interpreted it as a malfunction. They reacted with defensive violence. They spiked. They drove electrical needles deep into the Primarch's limbic system. Angron did not feel peace. He felt his brain boiling. He felt a pain that transcended the physical. He screamed. It was not a battle cry. It was the sound of a soul breaking. He dropped his axe. He clawed at his own head. He fell to his knees, thrashing in the dirt. The Emperor stepped back, confused. He looked at his hand. He looked at Whis, who was standing on the ramp of the dropship, eating a Nucerian tuber. Whis did not intervene. He watched with a neutral expression. The High Rider armies saw the confusion. They assumed the giant gladiator was wounded. The order was given. The artillery batteries opened fire. Shells whistled down on the ridge. The slaughter began. The shells landed among the slaves. Bodies were blown apart. Limbs flew through the air. The Emperor looked at the incoming fire. He saw the trajectories. He moved. He danced through the explosions. He was untouched. He reached the front lines of the High Rider forces. Soldiers fired las rifles at him. He sidestepped the beams. He redirected their aim with subtle nudges of his telekinesis. He caused them to shoot the ground or the sky. He disassembled their tanks by vibrating the molecular bonds of the drivetrains. But he did not kill them. The doctrine of the flow dictated that life should be preserved where possible. The Emperor saw these soldiers as potential resources. He saw them as ignorant children. He refused to crush them. He disarmed them. He broke their weapons. But there were tens of thousands of them. For every gun he dismantled, 3 more fired. And they were not firing at him. They were firing at the slaves on the ridge. Angron lay on the ground, paralyzed by the pain the Emperor had inadvertently triggered. He watched his brothers and sisters die. He saw Wenemaeus, his mentor, take a Lascanon shot to the chest. He saw the gladiators who had bled with him being cut down by heavy bolter fire. He looked at the Emperor. He saw his father dancing among the enemy, a blur of grey motion. He saw the Emperor refusing to strike a killing blow. He saw the Emperor sparing the lives of the slavers while the slaves were butchered. To Angron, this was not high philosophy. This was the ultimate cruelty. This was a god who had the power to save his family, but chose to play a game of pacifism instead. The High Riders realized the grey-clad stranger was not killing them. They grew bold. They ignored him. They focused all their fire on the ridge. The eaters of cities were wiped out. It took 10 minutes. The Emperor stood in the center of the enemy formation, surrounded by broken rifles and disabled tanks. But the massacre was complete. The ridge was a butcher's yard. Silence fell over the battlefield. The only sound was the wind and the sobbing of the dying. The Emperor walked back up the ridge. He looked at the bodies. He felt a pang of failure. He had adhered to the technique. He had not given in to anger. He had not used the warp to destroy. Yet the result was death. He approached Angron. The Primarch was trying to stand. The nails had ceased their punishment now that the threat of calm was gone. Angron looked at the Emperor. His eyes were red pits. He did not attack. He did not have the strength. He spoke in a whisper that carried across the silent field. He asked why. He asked why the Emperor had not killed them. The Emperor spoke of the larger picture. He spoke of the need to break the cycle of violence. He said that if he had slaughtered the High Rider army, he would have begun his relationship with this world in blood. He said he wanted to integrate Nuceria, not destroy it. Angron spat a mixture of blood and bile onto the Emperor's boots. He said the Emperor was a coward. He said the Emperor was worse than the slavers. The slavers killed because they were cruel. The Emperor let people die because he was arrogant. Greer and the Warhound Honor Guard arrived in Stormbirds. They secured the site. They saw the carnage. They saw their Primarch broken and weeping over the bodies of slaves. They saw the Emperor standing clean and untouched. They felt a shift in their loyalty. It was subtle but deep. They looked at the High Riders who were now surrendering, realizing the Off-Worlders were vastly superior. The Warhounds wanted to execute the High Riders. The Emperor forbade it. He ordered the Nucerian leadership to be brought to the negotiation table. He ordered Angron to be sedated and brought to the adamant resolve. In the apothecarion of the flagship, the tech priests examined Angron. They scanned the nails. The fabricator general's representative, a magos named Urtzi Malevolus, looked at the schematics with hunger. He saw the archaeotech. He saw how it interacted with the brain. He proposed removing them. The Emperor stood by the operating table. He looked at the device. He used his new perception. He saw that the nails had replaced parts of Angron's brain stem. To remove them was to kill the patient. The Emperor asked Whis if there was a way. Whis tapped his chin with his staff. He said that the body had accepted the device. To the body, the device was now self. To remove the self is to invite death. Whis said the Emperor could keep the sun or keep the ideal, but not both. The Emperor made his choice. He would not risk Angron's life. The nails would stay. Angron woke up 3 days later. He was in a cage. It was a comfortable cage, a luxury suite on the flagship. But it was a cage. Greer came to visit him. Greer knelt. He offered his bolter to the Primarch. He expected Angron to kill him. Angron took the bolter. He looked at it. He looked at Greer. He asked who the man in the grey tunic was. Greer said it was the Emperor, the master of mankind. Angron laughed. It was a dry, hacking sound. He said the master of mankind was a fool who watched dogs kill sheep and lectured the sheep on posture. Angron assumed command of the Tuetipant Legion, but he did not accept the Emperor's name for them. He did not accept warhounds, and he certainly did not accept the Emperor's doctrine of the flow. He gathered his captains. He told them what had happened on the ridge. He told them that the Emperor's perfection was a lie. He told them that the only honesty in the galaxy was pain. The Emperor wanted them to be silent monks. No. Angron wanted them to be loud. He wanted them to scream so the universe knew they were dying. The strategic catastrophe rippled outward. The Tuentui Legion began to disobey orders, not openly but tactically. When ordered to secure a city with minimal casualties, they would butcher the population. When the Emperor reprimanded Angron, Angron simply pointed to his head. He said the nails made him do it. He said he was just flowing with his nature, as the Emperor taught. It was a mockery, a dark mirror of the Emperor's philosophy. The Emperor could not punish Angron for a disability he had failed to cure. The Emperor was trapped by his own logic. Meanwhile, the crusade ground on. The incident at Nuceria had been recorded by the remembrancers. The footage of the Emperor dancing through the fire while slaves died circulated in the upper echelons of the fleet. It caused a crisis of faith. The mortal crews began to whisper. They said the Emperor did not care about human life. They said he only cared about his method. The humanity thread began to fray. Morale on the lower decks plummeted. Suicide rates among the serfs increased. They felt that if they were attacked, the Emperor would not save them unless it was efficient to do so. Whis found the Emperor in the cartography room. The Emperor was staring at a hologram of the galaxy. The light of the stars reflected in his eyes. He looked older. The unceasing effort to maintain his state of no mind was taking a toll. It was exhausting to be constantly relaxed. Whis ate a ration bar. He told the Emperor that he had made a mistake on Nuceria. The Emperor asked what the mistake was. He had saved the planet's infrastructure. He had secured the Primarch. He had minimized Imperial casualties to 0. Whis shook his head. He used the staff to draw a circle in the air. He said the Emperor was trying to be water, but he was acting like mist. Water crashes, water drowns, water erodes mountains. The Emperor was avoiding impact. Whis said that true mastery involves the decision to strike. The Emperor had hesitated because he feared his own strength. He feared that if he struck, he would become the tyrant he saw in his visions. Whis said that by refusing to be a tyrant to the guilty, he had become a tyrant to the innocent. The slaves died because the Emperor refused to get his hands dirty. The Emperor absorbed this. He realized his interpretation of the training had been flawed. He had swung too far into pacifism. He needed to find the middle path. But the damage was done. The Tui-2 Legion was corrupted, not by chaos, but by bitterness. They began to experiment. Apothecaries of the Tui-10, working with the data from Angron scans, began to replicate the butcher's nails. They did not have the archaeotech, but they created crude copies. The nails of the Legion were not as sophisticated, but they worked. They drove the Marines into a frenzy. The Emperor discovered this 6 months later. He summoned Angron. He demanded the implantation stop. Angron stood before the Emperor. The Primarch was twitching. The pain was constant. Angron smiled. He said his sons wanted to be closer to their father. He said since the Emperor would not share his burden, the sons would share the Primarch's burden. Angron issued an ultimatum. If the Emperor wanted the nails removed, he would have to kill the entire Legion. He would have to do what he refused to do on Nuceria. He would have to massacre his own subjects. The Emperor looked at the thousands of Astartes standing behind Angron. They had drilled cables into their skulls. They were foaming at the mouth. They were waiting for the order to kill or die. The Emperor saw the trap. If he fought them, he validated Khorne. If he let them be, he allowed a cancer to grow. He chose the third path, the path of quarantine. He ordered the Tui-10 Legion to the Ghoul Stars. He sent them to the farthest, darkest edge of the galaxy. He gave them a suicide mission, to clear the Xenos horrors that dwelt in the Halo Zone. He hoped they would die there. He hoped the problem would solve itself. It was a cold, calculated decision. It was efficient. It removed the variable. Angron accepted the order. He took his fleet into the dark. But he did not die. The Tui-2 Legion feasted on the horrors of the Ghoul Stars. They grew strong on the meat of nightmares. And in the warp, Khorne laughed. He had not won Angron's soul yet, but he had won his methodology. The Red Angel was born, not from the Emperor's tyranny, but from his neglect. This ended with a report from the Mechanicus. Magos Malevolus had not gone with the Tui-2. He had stayed behind on Mars. He had kept a copy of the nail schematics. He sent a coded transmission to a forge world on the edge of the Eye of Terror. The message was simple. The Omni-Messiah is flawed. The flesh is weak, but the machine bites. The seeds of the Dark Mechanicum were sown. watered by the Emperor's refusal to destroy the technology when he had the chance. On Terra, Malcador sat on the golden throne, testing its systems. He felt the tremor in the warp. He felt the shadow of the Tantine Legion growing longer. He spoke to the empty room. He said that a father who sends his mad dog away does not cure the dog. He only ensures that when the dog returns, it will be hungry. The Emperor returned to his training chamber. He picked up the wooden sword. He looked at Whis. He asked to go again. He attacked. This time there was a snarl on his face. He swung with intent. Whis dodged, but the wind of the blade cut a lock of the attendant's white hair. The hair floated to the floor. Whis looked at the hair. He smiled. He said that was better. He said that was honest. The Emperor did not smile. He knew that honesty had come too late for the eaters of cities, and he knew that somewhere in the dark, Angron was screaming his name. The fleets moved on. The 63rd expedition found a world called 6319. The War Master was not Horus. In this timeline, Horus had been found early, but he was not the favorite. The lion was the favorite. The lion was the first. Horus was jealous. He watched the logs of the Tyranids Legion. He saw the potential for a weapon that the Emperor was too afraid to use. Horus began to correspond with Angron. He sent supplies. He sent ammunition. He sent sympathy. The alliance of the broken was forming. The catastrophe was not a lost battle. It was the loss of the moral high ground. The Imperium was no longer a savior. It was a manager of symptoms, and the disease was spreading. The scribe who replaced Caleb was a woman named Aria. She filed the report on Nuceria into the archives. She marked it classified magenta. She paused. She took a quill and wrote a small note in the margin of her personal diary. "The Emperor moves like water," she wrote. "But water washes away the foundation of the house just as easily as it washes away the filth." She closed the book. The ink was still wet. It looked like blood. The strategic landscape of the Great Crusade shifted dramatically in the 30th year of the expansion. The initial doctrine of surgical compliance had reached its logical limit. The Imperium had expanded rapidly, bypassing hard targets to secure resource-rich worlds with minimal resistance. This created a map that looked like a piece of lace, full of holes and gaps where dangerous Xenos empires still festered, surrounded but not defeated. The Emperor's philosophy of the flow, as taught by the attendant Whis, emphasized non-resistance and the path of least effort. In void navigation, this meant riding the warp currents. In politics, it meant assimilating compliant populations without breaking their industry. In war, it meant decapitation strikes. But the galaxy is not a compliant dueling partner. It is a messy biological organism, and the infection in the Ulanor sector revealed the catastrophic flaw in a pacifist strategy applied to a genocidal universe. The Ulanor sector was dominated by the Orc Empire of Urlak Uruk. These were not the scavengers of the fringes. These were prime orcs, evolved in the crucible of constant war. They did not care about supply lines. They did not care about morale. They were a fungal tide. The Imperial Army expeditionary fleets, accustomed to the new doctrine of hold and negotiate, were overrun. The soldiers of the Imperial Auxilia had been trained to fire warning shots. They had been trained to seek surrender. The orcs did not surrender. They butchered the Auxilia in the trenches. They ate the diplomats. The efficiency of the Emperor's new Imperium shattered against the wall of green brute force. The call for reinforcement went out. It was not a call for negotiation. It was a scream for survival. The Emperor received the reports on the bridge of the Bucephalus. He saw the casualty rates. Entire systems were being depopulated. The humanity threat tightened. On the lower decks of the transport ships, the ration paste had turned green from algae blooms in the recyclers. Dysentery was killing more crewmen than enemy fire. The paperwork required to authorize a bombardment mission took 3 days to process through the Senatorum Imperialis, which was obsessed with preserving Xenos infrastructure for future use. By the time the authorization arrived, the colony was already gone. The Emperor realized that the flow required a rock to break against. He summoned his sons. He called for the Lion, the master of the First Legion. He called for Horus, the master of the 16th. He called for Sanguinius, the angel. They converged on the Ulanor system. The muster was the largest gathering of Astartes power since the beginning of the Crusade. But the mood was not one of triumph. It was one of confusion. The Primarchs had been raising their legions under conflicting doctrines. The Lion's Dark Angels were silent killers, executing the Emperor's Void Strike tactics with terrifying precision. Horus's Lunar Wolves were aggressive, straining against the leash, remembering the old ways of war. Sanguinius's Blood Angels were trying to transmute their inner rage into art. But on Ulanor, art was useless. The assault on the capital world of Ulanor Prime was the inflection point. The plan was a classic application of the Emperor's new school, a precise teleportation strike directly into Urlak Uruk's throne room. Decapitate the leader and the war dissolves. It was efficient, it was clean, it was logical. The Emperor, accompanied by his custodes and the attendant Whis, teleported to the surface. They materialized in the shadow of the Gargant Towers. The air smelled of burning oil and roasting meat. The roar of the orcs was a physical pressure, a wall of sound that vibrated the armor of the custodes. Urlak Uruk sat on a throne of crushed chimeras. He was 12 meters tall. He saw the golden light of the teleport flare. He did not feel fear. He felt joy. The Emperor stepped forward. He held his sword low. He entered the state of no mind. He let his perception expand to encompass the entire chamber. He saw the vectors of attack. He saw the muscle tension in the Orc warlord's arm. Uruk charged. The power claw snapped shut on the air where the Emperor had been. The Emperor flowed around the Orc. He struck at the nerve clusters. He struck at the tendons. But Urlak Uruk was not a human duelist. He was a biological tank. The Emperor's precise, non-lethal strikes, designed to disable, merely annoyed the beast. The Emperor cut a tendon. The Orc's physiology instantly compensated with redundant muscle groups. The Emperor struck a nerve center. The Orc's nervous system was too primitive and distributed to care. The Emperor danced. He dodged. He was untouchable. But he was not winning. The fight dragged on. The Orcs in the gallery cheered. They thought this was a game. They thought the shiny little Humie was playing hard to get. Whis stood on a balcony, watching. He held a skewered lizard he had purchased from a panicked goblin vendor before the teleportation. He took a bite. He called down to the Emperor. He said the Emperor was overthinking the concept of mercy. He said that a gardener does not negotiate with a weed. He said that to flow with the universe, one must sometimes accept that the universe is violent. Destruction is also a part of creation. The Emperor heard him. He looked at the endless tide of greenskins pouring into the chamber. He looked at his custodes, who were fighting a desperate defensive circle. They were being dragged down by sheer weight of numbers. A custodian died, his helmet crushed by a power hammer. The perfection was breaking. The silence was being drowned out. The Emperor felt a flicker of frustration. It was the first time in decades he had felt it. He realized that the scalpel was broken. He needed the hammer. The Emperor stopped dancing. He stopped trying to be water. He planted his feet. He channeled the warp. Not the subtle guidance of the past years, but the raw, screaming power of the anathema. He let his soul burn. A wave of golden psychic fire exploded from his body. It was not a precise cut. It was a nuclear detonation of the soul. The fire washed over the throne room. It incinerated the orcs. It vaporized Urlak Uruk, stripping the flesh from his bones until only ash remained. The tower shook. The psychic scream echoed across the planet. Every orc on Ulanor felt the fear of death for the first time. The Wag broke instantly. The silence returned, but it was not the peaceful silence of the dojo. It was the silence of a graveyard. The Emperor stood amidst the ash. His grey tunic was scorched. He looked at his hands. They were shaking. He had failed the test. He had resorted to brute force. He had lost control of the flow. Whis floated down from the balcony. He tossed the lizard stick away. He looked at the Emperor with a serious expression. He said that the Emperor had stepped back into the river of causality. By using that much power, he had lit a beacon. The Chaos Gods, who had been confused by his subtlety, now had a lock on him again. The great game was back on. The strategic chain reaction began immediately. The Emperor summoned the Primarchs to the surface. They stood in the ashes of the Orc capital. They saw the destruction. Horus smiled. He saw the power. He saw that his father was still a warrior. The lion looked at the ash and calculated the unnecessary expenditure of psychic energy. Sanguinius wept for the loss of potential life. For even orcs were living things in his eyes, twisted as they were. The Emperor announced his decision. He could not lead the crusade. The incident with the orcs had proven that his presence on the front lines was a liability. He was too powerful, yet too constrained by his new philosophy to use that power effectively without risking a psychic backlash. He needed to return to Terra. He needed to build the webway. If humanity could travel without the warp, the Chaos Gods would be starved. He could finally achieve the peace he sought, but he needed someone to manage the galaxy while he worked. He needed a war master. In the standard timeline, he chose Horus for his charisma. In this timeline, the Emperor valued efficiency and silence above all else. He looked to Horus. Horus was proud, loud, and needed validation. He looked at the lion. The lion was a cipher. The lion followed orders. The lion did not need applause. The lion had mastered the void strike better than any other. The Emperor named Lion L. Johnson as the Lord Commander of the Imperium. The shock was palpable. Horus did not rage. He went cold. He bowed, but his eyes were dead. The Emperor gave the lion his mandate. Keep the galaxy quiet. Do not expand unless necessary. Consolidate. Build the walls. I will be in the dungeon. The Emperor handed the lion a decree. It was the Council of Terror Edict. It established a civilian government to handle the logistics. The Astartes were to be the guardians, not the rulers. This was the final insult to Horus. He was not only passed over for command, but he was also told he was merely a weapon to be shelved when not in use. The Emperor boarded the Bucephalus and left for Terra. Whis went with him, though the attendant looked back at Horus with a curious tilt of his head. Whis whispered to the Emperor that leaving a cracked vessel on the fire is unwise. The Emperor replied that he had no choice. He had to fix the foundation. The departure of the Emperor created a vacuum. The lion, as Lord Commander, was ruthless. He established a new protocol of compliance by silence. If a world resisted, the Dark Angels did not invade. They used cyclonic torpedoes to destroy the planet's industry from orbit, leaving the population alive but destitute, forcing them to surrender or starve. It was the logical extreme of the Emperor's minimal contact doctrine. It was horrific. The humanity thread snapped. Reports of mass starvation on compliant worlds flooded the archives. The bureaucracy in the Senatorum Imperialis could not keep up with the relief efforts. The average imperial citizen began to see the Astartes not as angels, but as the spectres of death who brought famine. Horus took the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet to the fringes. He was bitter. He felt betrayed. He began to look for answers. He found them not in the warp, but in the archives of the lost. He opened a channel to the Ghoul stars. The signal was faint, distorted by the radiation of the galactic halo. He called out to Angron. Angron answered. The Red Angel had changed. The isolation in the Ghoul stars, combined with the crude butcher's nails, had devolved the 12-2 Legion into a pack of cannibalistic hunters. But they had survived. Angron listened to Horus's grievances. Angron laughed. He said the Emperor was a hypocrite who preached water but burned worlds when it suited him. Horus asked Angron if he wanted revenge. Angron said he didn't want revenge. He wanted noise. He wanted to drown out the silence of the Emperor's lie. The conspiracy grew. It was not yet a rebellion of chaos. It was a rebellion of the discarded. Lorgar Aurelian, the Primarch of the Word-Bearers, joined them. Lorgar had been preaching the divinity of the Emperor, but the Emperor's utter silence and refusal to acknowledge him had driven Lorgar mad. Lorgar concluded that the Emperor was not a god, but a vessel waiting to be filled. Lorgar had gone into the Eye of Terror to find the true voice. He had found the primordial truth. He brought the Book of Lorgar to Horus. He showed Horus that there were beings in the warp who did not demand silence. They demanded action. They demanded blood and change and excess and decay. They were the opposite of the flow. They were the storm. The strategic situation deteriorated. The Lion focused on the core worlds and the fortification of the segmentum solar, ignored the rumors from the fringe. He dismissed the erratic movements of the 63rd and the 12th Legions as inefficiencies. The Lion lacked the emotional intelligence to see the betrayal coming. He assumed that because they were Astartes, they would follow the logic of the hierarchy. It was a fatal error. On Terra, the Emperor began his great work. He excavated the caverns beneath the Imperial Palace. He built the Golden Throne. But in this timeline, the throne was not just a portal generator. It was a psychic dampener. It was designed to amplify the state of no mind across the entire planet. The Emperor wanted to create a zone of absolute psychic tranquility where demons could not exist. He brought Magnus the Red to Terra. Magnus was the key. The Emperor had modified Magnus's genes to be a stabilizer. He told Magnus his destiny. Magnus was to sit on the throne. He was to surrender his consciousness to the machine. He was to become the anchor. Magnus was horrified. He was a scholar. He wanted to explore the great ocean, not dam it up. He argued with his father. He said that knowledge should be free. The Emperor, tired and focused on the schematics, snapped at him. He told Magnus that knowledge without control is a cancer. He ordered Magnus to take the seat. Magnus sat. The machine activated. The psychic dampening field expanded. For a moment it was beautiful. The constant background screaming of the warp vanished from Terra. The skies cleared. But for Magnus, it was hell. He was cut off from the ether. He was blind and deaf in the only way that mattered to him. He sat in the dark, a prisoner of his father's peace. Whis watched this from the shadows of the throne room. He did not eat. He tapped his staff on the floor. He spoke to the air. He said that a cage is still a cage, even if it is made of gold and silence. He said that by suppressing the nature of his son, the Emperor was creating a pressure cooker. The catastrophe struck in the 31st millennium. The small choice that led to the massive outcome happened in the Davin system. Horus was wounded on the moon of Davin, not by a magic blade, but by a standard toxic round from a rebel bolter. He was dying. His body, fighting the poison, fell into a coma. The Mournival, his advisors, were desperate. Erebus, the first chaplain of the Word-Bearers, stepped in. He offered a cure. He suggested they take Horus to the Serpent Lodge. Inside the lodge, Horus's spirit was cast into the warp, but he did not see a vision of the future where the Emperor was a god. He saw a vision of the past. He saw the Emperor on Nuceria, letting the slaves die. He saw the Emperor on Ulana, burning the orcs while preaching peace. He saw the Emperor on Terra, locking Magnus in a chair. The Chaos Gods did not need to lie to Horus. They only had to show him the truth from a certain angle. They showed him that the Emperor's flow was actually indifference. They told Horus that the galaxy was dying of boredom. They offered him the power to make it live again, to make it vibrant, violent, and real. Horus woke up. The wound was healed. His eyes were changed. They were not the eyes of a general anymore. They were the eyes of a predator who had realized the zookeeper left the gate open. He contacted Lorgar. He contacted Angron. He contacted Fulgrim, who was bored of the aesthetic perfection the Emperor demanded and craved new sensations. He contacted Mortarion, who hated the tyranny of the Psyker Emperor. The Istvan atrocity was planned, but it would not be a bombardment. It would be a ritual. Horus chose the Istvan system not for its strategic value, but for its acoustic properties in the war. He gathered the loyalist elements of the traitor legions, the captains who still believed in the Emperor's silence. He sent them to the surface of Istvan III. Then he did not bomb them. He unleashed the Life-Eater virus, but he modified it with the help of the Dark Mechanicum and the biological data from the Nucerian nails. The virus did not just dissolve flesh. It drove the victims into a state of hyper-adrenal mania before they dissolved. The loyalists on the ground did not die quickly. They tore each other apart in a frenzy of chemically induced rage. It was the ultimate rejection of the Emperor's doctrine. It was a mass sacrifice of pure, unadulterated noise and violence. The psychic scream of the Istvan sacrifice hit Terra. It was so loud it cracked the psychic dampening fields of the Golden Throne. Magnus, trapped in the chair, felt the surge. The barrier broke. The warp flooded back into his mind. He saw what Horus had done. He saw the betrayal. He tried to warn the Emperor. He projected his astral form from the throne. But the Emperor was deep in the webway tunnels, fighting a breach caused by a Drukhari raid. He was cut off from the surface. Magnus's projection arrived in the throne room, but the Emperor wasn't there. Only Malkador and Valdor were present. Magnus panicked. He tried to force the message through the webway gate. He pushed with all his might, amplified by the throne's broken limiters. He shattered the webway project. The psychic shockwave destroyed the delicate lattice the Emperor had built. The tunnel collapsed. The Emperor was thrown back into the material realm, his work in ruins. Demons poured through the breach in the basement of the palace. The war within the webway began instantly. The Emperor stood before the broken gate. He saw the tide of demons. He saw the years of work wasted. He saw Whis standing there looking at the burning machinery. The Emperor did not rage. He went completely still. The humanity thread of the narrative snapped into focus. The scribe Area, recording the events in the upper spire, noted that the lights of the palace flickered and died. The heating systems failed. Terror began to freeze. The logistical support for the sector collapsed as the Astronomicon flickered. In the darkness, billions of humans looked up and realized the silence was over. The scream had begun. The Emperor looked at Magnus, who had returned to his body, weeping in the chair. The Emperor did not scold him. He did not banish him. He simply walked over, pulled Magnus out of the chair, and sat on it himself. He had to hold the gate shut. He had to hold the universe together with his mind again. The lesson of the flow was over. The Emperor became the cork. He looked at Valdor. He gave one order. Summon the lion. Tell him the wolf is loose. Tell him to kill everything that makes a sound. The traitors were not just rebels. They were a carnival of horrors, a riot of noise and color and sensation. The loyalists, led by the lion, were the silence of the grave, the cold efficiency of the executioner. The middle ground was gone. The war would not be fought for territory. It would be fought for the frequency of reality itself. And in the corner of the dungeon, Whis floated in the air, watching the Emperor strain against the psychic tide. Whis took a bite of a synthetic peach. A pity, he said to no one. He was almost starting to get the footwork right. The chronicle paused. The data slate hissed static. The strategic readout showed the Istvan system glowing with a sickly, bruised light. The casualty counter began to spin so fast it became a blur. The history of the Imperium ceased to be a record of expansion and became a record of survival. The age of the flow was dead. The age of the scream had arrived. The war was a creature of paradox. On one side, the traitor legions, fueled by the scream of the warp, moved with erratic, terrifying energy. Their campaigns were not logical assaults, but ritualistic butcheries designed to tear the veil of reality. On the other side, the Loyalists, under the Lord Commander Lion L. Johnson, fought with a silence that was almost as inhuman as the enemy's noise. The Lion had taken the Emperor's mandate to kill everything that makes a sound. Literally. The Dark Angels and their allied regiments did not liberate worlds, they purged them. If a planet showed signs of chaotic corruption, riots, strange weather, unauthorized broadcasts, the Lion's fleets did not send ground troops. They deployed cyclonic torpedoes. They cracked the crust. They silenced the planet. This strategy was strategically sound but morally bankrupt. It denied the traitors the biomass and ritual sites they needed, but it also bled the Imperium white. The humanity thread was now a raw nerve. On the agri-world of Kalth, the population was not fighting word-bearers. They were fighting starvation, because the Lion had diverted all grain convoys to the fortress worlds of the Segmentum Solar. Men and women ate the leather of their boots. They boiled the wallpaper for starch. They died in the millions, not from bolter fire, but from the cold calculus of the loyalist war machine. The Emperor sat on the golden throne. He was no longer the active teacher. He was the battery. His mind was locked in a permanent struggle with the warp rift beneath the palace. He could not speak. He could not move. But he could see. He watched the galaxy burn through the eyes of the Astronomicon. He saw the Lion's genocide. He saw the madness of Horus. And he saw the attendant, Whis, who still wandered the Imperial dungeon. Whis was the only being who could enter the throne room without being incinerated by the psychic pressure. He would sit by the base of the throne, reading ancient texts or napping. Sometimes he would look up at the agony on the Emperor's face and offer a simple observation. "You are holding your breath again," he would say. "You cannot hold your breath forever." The small choice that would define the war happened far from Terra in the Cygnus cluster. Sanguinius and the Blood Angels had been sent there by Horus before the betrayal. A trap to corrupt the angel. In the standard history, Sanguinius fought the demon Kabanda and resisted the Red Thirst through sheer nobility. In this timeline, Sanguinius had been trying to follow the Emperor's doctrine of the flow. He had been trying to meditate his way through the genetic flaw of his lineage, but the stress of the trap, the psychic weight of the daemon, and the isolation broke his control. Kabanda taunted him. The demon showed him the lion's atrocities. He showed Sanguinius the worlds burning under loyalist fire. He asked Sanguinius, "Is this the peace you fight for, the silence of the tomb?" Sanguinius looked at his sons. They were dying. The demon knocked Sanguinius to the ground. It broke his legs. It stood over him, preparing the final blow. Sanguinius had a choice. He could accept death with the dignity of the flow, or he could tap into the rage he had suppressed for a century. He looked at the demon's axe. He thought of his father on the throne, paralyzed by his own power. He thought of Angron, broken by neglect. Sanguinius realized that the Emperor's teaching was incomplete. Passive acceptance was death. Uncontrolled rage was damnation. But there had to be a third state, a state of controlled fury, a holy wrath. Sanguinius chose to let go, but he did not let go to chaos. He let go to the beast inside himself. He embraced the red thirst, but he harnessed it with the discipline of a high artist. He rose from the ground, his broken legs knit together with a sickening crunch of bone and muscle. His eyes went black. He did not scream. He hissed. He flew at Kabanda. He did not use a weapon. He tore the demon apart with his bare hands. He ripped the wings from the bloodthirster's back. He drank the demon's ichor. It was a victory, but it changed the blood angels. They were no longer the noble artists. They were vampires. They were the eaters of the dead. Sanguinius gathered his fleet. He did not return to Terra. He did not join the lion. He went rogue. He declared that he would save the Imperium, but he would not save it for the Emperor. He would save the people. The Blood Angels began a campaign of intervention. They dropped onto worlds the lion was about to exterminate. They slaughtered the traitors, but they also threatened the loyalists. They evacuated civilians. They became a third faction, the Red Host. They were terrifying, blood-drinking saviors. This strategic reversal threw the lion's calculations into chaos. He could not predict Sanguinius. The Blood Angels were stealing his resources, the populations, and disrupting his firebreaks. The lion, cold and logical, declared Sanguinius a traitor excommunicate traitores. He ordered the Dark Angels to fire on the Blood Angels. The war became a three-way slaughter. Horus watched this from the bridge of the vengeful spirit. He laughed until he wept. The Imperium was eating itself. The loyalists were fighting each other. The path to terror was open. He gave the order for the final push. The ruin storm was summoned. The traitor fleets rode the warp storm straight for the Sol system. The invasion of the Sol system was not a battle. It was a deluge. The Alpha Legion sabotaged the orbital defenses around Pluto. The Iron Warriors smashed the fortifications of Uranus. The World Eaters, now completely lost to the nails and corn, butchered the populations of the Jovian moons. The Lion pulled his fleets back to Terra. He abandoned the outer system. He sacrificed billions to buy time. He turned Terra into a fortress. He evacuated the civilian population from the outer continents and concentrated them in the mega hives, turning the rest of the planet into a killing zone of minefields and trenches. The siege of Terra began. The skies turned black with drop pods. The walls of the palace shook under bombardment. The lion stood on the eternity wall. He commanded the defense with the precision of a machine. He traded space for time. He traded lives for ammunition. He was brilliant, but he was uninspiring. The soldiers of the Imperial army fought because they were terrified of him, not because they loved him. Morale was brittle. Deep in the dungeon, the Emperor felt the walls shaking. He felt the presence of his sons. He felt Horus, swollen with the power of the four gods. He felt Angron, a creature of pure hate. He felt Fulgrim, a snake of sensation. He felt Mortarion, a cloud of plague. The Emperor's mind began to fracture. The strain of holding the webway gate while the Chaos Gods battered his psychic shields was too much. Whis stood up. He finished the book he was reading. It was a pre-Unity text on gardening. He walked to the throne. He looked at the Emperor. "The weed has grown tall," Whis said. "You let it grow because you did not want to cut the flower next to it. Now the weed is strangling the flower. You must choose." The Emperor looked at Whis. He communicated telepathically. "I cannot let go of the gate. If I do, terror falls to the demons from below." Whis nodded. "Yes, but if you do not act, terror falls to the demons from above. You are in checkmate, King of Men, unless you change the rules." The Emperor understood. He had one card left, a card he had buried deep in the vaults of his own mind, the Psychic Awakening. He could trigger the latent potential in the human race. He could force the evolution he had been trying to guide slowly. But to do it now, under this stress, would be catastrophic. It would burn out billions of minds. It would create a race of unstable psychers, but it would also create a wave of psychic energy that could scour the traitors from the planet. It was the ultimate gamble. The Emperor hesitated. He looked at the humanity thread. He saw a young conscript on the wall, shivering in the rain, clutching a laser gun. The boy's name was Alanius. He wasn't a perpetual in this timeline. He was just a boy. He was terrified. He was writing a letter to his mother, who was already dead in a hive that the lion had vented to space to save oxygen. The Emperor felt the boy's fear. He felt the boy's hopelessness. The Emperor made his decision. He would not sacrifice the species to save the Empire. He would not trigger the awakening. He would fight as a man. He contacted the lion. "Open the Eternity Gate." The lion refused. "My lord, that is illogical. The enemy is at the threshold. To open the gate is suicide." The Emperor pushed his voice into the lion's mind. It was not the voice of the flow. It was the voice of the Father. "I said, open the gate. I am coming out." The lion obeyed. The massive adamantium gates ground open. The defenders on the steps were shocked. They expected a countercharge of custodies. Instead, they saw a single figure emerge. The Emperor had left the throne. The moment he stood up, the webway gate in the dungeon burst open. The demons poured in. But the Emperor had prepared a failsafe. He had rigged the golden throne to overload. As he walked out of the dungeon, he triggered the dead man switch. The throne exploded. It didn't destroy the planet, but it collapsed the singularity. It sealed the breach permanently, burying the dungeon, the tech priests, and the demons under miles of molten rock. It also buried Whis. The attendant did not try to escape. He simply waved goodbye as the ceiling came down. The Emperor walked onto the battlefield of the Eternity Port. He was burning. His body was literally disintegrating from the psychic backlash of the throne's destruction and the uncontained power he was now channeling. He was a walking sun. The traitors saw him. They froze. The diamonds recoiled. The anathema was unmasked. Horus saw him from the orbit. He teleported down. He wanted to kill his father himself. He landed on the steps. The two gods stood facing each other. Horus was a monster of swollen flesh and chaotic armor. The Emperor was a figure of golden light that was rapidly fading into grey ash. Horus laughed. "You left your chair, father. You have lost the game." The Emperor looked at Horus. He saw the strings of the Chaos Gods attached to his son's soul. He saw that Horus was not free. He was a puppet. The Emperor felt a profound sadness. He stepped forward. He did not raise a sword. He raised his hand. Horus struck. He hit the Emperor with the World Breaker Maul. It shattered the Emperor's ribs, It pulped his internal organs. The Emperor fell. Horus struck again. He tore off the Emperor's arm. The Custodes tried to intervene, but Horus flayed them with a look. The lion charged, swinging his sword, but Horus backhanded him into the stone wall, breaking his spine. Sanguinius, who had arrived late to the battle, dove from the sky, a red comet. Horus caught the angel by the throat and snapped his neck before throwing him aside. The Emperor lay in the mud. He was dying. His vision was fading. He looked at Horus. Horus stood over him, raising the talon of Horus for the killing blow. "Why?" Horus screamed. "Why did you deny us? Why did you demand silence?" The Emperor coughed blood. He whispered, "Because the noise attracts the predators." Horus paused. For a second, the Chaos God's grip slipped. Horus looked at his father. He looked at the ruin of Terra. He saw what he had become. A tear of pure oil ran down his cheek. But the gods yanked the leash. Horus roared and brought the claw down. Suddenly, a wooden stick tapped Horus on the shoulder. It was a light tap, a playful tap. Horus spun around. Standing there amidst the blood and fire was Whis. He was dusty, his robes were torn, but he was alive. He had phased through the collapse. He held the stick. "Your form is terrible," Whis said to Horus. "You are all tension, no balance." Horus stared. "What are you?" Whis smiled. "I am the lesson your father failed to learn, but perhaps you can learn it." Whis tapped the ground with his staff. Time seemed to stutter. The entire battlefield froze for a microsecond. In that frozen moment, the Emperor saw the opening. He saw the single flaw in Horus's defense, the chink in the armor where the soul was still human. The Emperor did not use the flow. He did not use the scream. He used the sacrifice. He poured the entirety of his remaining life force, his soul, his memories, his hope, into a single psychic lance. He did not aim it at Horus's body. He aimed it at the connection between Horus and the Chaos Gods. He fired. The lance struck Horus. It severed the cords of the Four. The backlash was apocalyptic. The psychic scream cleared the clouds over Terra. It banished every demon in the Sol system instantly. The traitor fleets in orbit lost power as their demon engines died. Horus fell. He was stripped of the chaos power. He was just a dying man, his soul burned out by the separation. He looked at the Emperor. The Emperor was a husk, a skeletal figure lying in the ash. Horus crawled to his father. He took the Emperor's hand. "Father." The Emperor looked at him. His eyes were blind. "Quiet," the Emperor whispered. "Quiet now." The Emperor died. The psychic shockwave of his death hit the galaxy. It was not a beacon. It was a shroud. The Astronomicon went out. The Imperium was plunged into darkness. Navigation was impossible. The fleets were stranded. The worlds were isolated. The silence had finally come. We stood over the bodies of the two demigods. He looked at the devastation. He looked at the lion, broken but alive. He looked at the body of Sanguinius. He looked at the terrified soldiers of the Imperial army. We sighed. He tapped his staff again. "Class dismissed," he said softly. He began to walk away. He walked through the lines of the traitors, who were now panicking as their gods abandoned them. He walked through the lines of the loyalists, who were weeping. He walked out of the palace. He walked into the ruins of the manufactorums. He vanished into the dust. The aftermath was immediate chaos. The traitor legions, leaderless and power-stripped, fled. They ran for the Eye of Terror, not as conquerors, but as refugees. The loyalists could not pursue. They were broken. The lion was paralyzed. Dawn was missing, lost in the full system in this timeline. Guilliman was on the other side of the ruin storm, which was now a permanent wall of storms cutting the galaxy in half. The Imperium fractured. It did not die, but it ceased to be a unified entity. It became a collection of warlord states. The Lion, confined to a stasis cradle, ruled the Segmentum Solar as a military junta. He enforced the Pax Mortis. Silence was law. Music was banned. Art was banned. Emotion was regulated. It was a North Korea of the stars extending across 1,000 light years. In the east, Guilliman created the Imperium Secundus. It was a rational, bureaucratic state, trying to preserve the light of civilization. But it was surrounded by darkness. In the blood-dark regions of the halo stars, the Blood Angels established the Red Kingdom. They protected humans, but they demanded a blood tithe. They were benevolent monsters, and in the eye of terror, the traitor legions fought each other. Abaddon did not rise to unite them. Without Horus, and with the Emperor dead, the Long War lost its meaning. They became mere pirates, raiders in the dark. The humanity thread ended with the son of Alanius. He survived the siege. He returned to the ruins of his hive. He found his mother's body. He buried her. He found a single seed in her pocket, a seed from a flower that had grown in the palace gardens before the war. He planted it in the ash. He sat down to wait. There was no sun to warm it. The sky was grey. The air was cold. But the boy waited. He didn't pray to the emperor. The emperor was dead. He didn't pray to the gods. The gods were cruel. He just waited for the flower to grow. It was a small, illogical act of hope. So, the chronicle ends here. The record is fragmented. The galaxy is dark. But in the darkness, there are no shadows. Only the silence. And in the silence, perhaps, something new can finally begin. The data slate powers down. The archive is closed. The veteran narrative designer leans back in his chair. The story is told. It is not a happy story. It is a story of consequences. It is a story of how the desire for perfection can lead to the ultimate imperfection, the end of the dream. The user must now decide if they wish to read the epilogue, to see what grows in the ash, or if they wish to leave the galaxy to its quiet fate. The 500 years following the death of the Emperor were known to history as the era of the long silence. The galaxy did not burn. It froze. The Astronomicon was gone. The guiding light that had allowed humanity to navigate the tides of the warp had been extinguished by the psychic death scream of the master of mankind. Interstellar travel reverted to the Dark Ages. Ships could only make short, calculated jumps of a few light years, blindly skipping across the surface of the Imperium like stones on a pond. The cohesion of the Imperium dissolved. It was no longer an empire. It was an archipelago of isolated islands in a sea of night. The Segmentum Solar, ruled by the military junta of the Eye Legion, became a fortress of dust. The Lion, broken in body and spirit, remained in the stasis cradle within the deepest vaults of the Imperial Palace. He was not dead, but he refused to wake. His subconscious mind, linked to the cogitator banks of the planetary defense grid, directed the Pax Mortis. It was a rule of absolute logic. Resources were rationed to the calorie. Procreation was permitted only by permit. Deviation from the schedule was punished by liquidation. Terror was safe. Terror was quiet. Terror was a prison. In the Ultima Segmentum, Roboute, Guilliman, held the fragile light of Imperium Secundus. He had the Pharos device on Sotha, a Zenith beacon that allowed for limited navigation. But the Pharos was a finite resource. It burned with an empathy-based energy that required a toll. Guilliman aged. His hair turned white. The stress of holding 500 worlds together without the authority of terror was killing him. He looked at the stars and saw them going out one by one. He knew something was coming. He did not know what it was, but he could feel the pressure of it against the edges of his domain. The silence of the galaxy was not empty, it was holding its breath. The threat revealed itself in the year 544.M32. It did not come from the Eye of Terror. The traitor legions were busy eating each other in the hell space of the warp, fighting over scraps of demon flesh. The threat came from the intergalactic void. The Tyranids had arrived. They had been drawn not by the Astronomicon, but by the Pharaohs. The beacon on Sotha, shining in the psychic darkness, was a dinner bell ringing in a famine. The attack was not a war. It was a biological process. The Tyranid hive ships descended on the fringe worlds of Imperium Secundus. They did not negotiate. They did not posture. They consumed. The defense of the agri-world of Prandium was the first test of the post-Emperor doctrine. The Ultramarines fought with the tactical brilliance Guilliman had instilled in them. They set up overlapping fields of fire. They used bait tactics. They fought with courage and honor. It did not matter. The Tyranids absorbed the biomass of the fallen. For every space marine who died, the hive mind created 1,000 gaunts. The attrition rates were mathematically impossible to sustain. Guilliman stood in the strategium of Macraga, watching the hololiths turn red. He realized the terrifying truth. The Emperor's doctrine of the flow, of precise movement and conservation of energy, was useless against an enemy that was infinite. You cannot flow around a tidal wave. You drown. The despair of the situation was compounded by the silence. Guilliman sent distress signals to Terra. He sent courier ships into the long dark, carrying pleas for reinforcement. None returned. The Pax Mortis of the Lion did not care about the Ultima Segmentum. To the logic engines of Terra, Ultramar was a non-essential asset. The logical action was to let the Tyranids eat it, buying time for the core worlds to fortify further. Guilliman was alone. The turning point came from the dead. On the forge world of Mars, the silence had been different. The Mechanicum, severed from the Emperor's guidance and the Astronomicon, had turned inward. They had sealed the vaults. They had obsessed over the data recorded during the Emperor's final years. They analyzed the flow. They analyzed the silence. And deep in the Noctis labyrinth, something woke up. It was not the dragon. It was the guardians of the dragon. A Necron tomb ship, silent as the grave, materialized in the orbit of Mars. It did not use the warp. It used inertialess drives that defied the laws of physics understood by the Magos. The defense lasers of the Ring of Iron tracked the vessel, but did not fire. The ship broadcast a code. It was an override command from the dark age of technology, a handshake protocol that the Mechanicum's cogitators recognized as authority, absolute. The Silent King, Sarek, had returned from his exile. He had seen the Tyranids in the void. He had seen the threat they posed to his plan for biotransference. He needed organic bodies to reclaim his people's souls. If the Tyranids ate all the biomass, the Necrons would be machines forever. Sarek had looked at the Imperium. He had seen the Emperor's work. He had seen the suppression of the warp, the destruction of the Golden Throne, and the enforcement of silence. To Zarek, the Emperor was not a failure. He was the visionary who had almost understood. The Emperor had tried to make humanity like the Necrons, soulless, efficient, ordered. He had failed because he was still too human. He had hesitated. Zarek would not hesitate. The Necron Overlord did not descend to Mars. He transmitted a hologram to the high altar of the Omni Messiah. He spoke to the Fabricator General in binary cant, perfect and cold. He offered a trade. He would save humanity from the Great Devourer. He would provide the technology to seal the warp rifts forever. He would give them the pylon networks. In exchange, humanity would submit, not as slaves, but as subjects. They would become the client species of the infinite empire. They would be the clay from which the Necrons would eventually sculpt their new bodies. The Fabricator General calculated. The probability of survival against the Tyranids without aid was 0.00%. The probability of survival as a Necron protectorate was 43.6%. The logic was inescapable. Mars accepted. The Treaty of the Labyrinth was signed in scrap code. Guilliman received the news not via astropath but via a Necron dolmen gate that opened directly on the surface of Macrugga. A monolith floated out, black and green, humming with anti-psychic energy. A cryptek emerged. He bore a message from Mars. He told Guilliman that the solution had been found. He told Guilliman that the preservation of the species required the sacrifice of its sovereignty. Guilliman looked at the message. He looked at the sky, where the spore clouds of the Tyranids were already darkening the stars of the Hera crown. He was a statesman. He was a pragmatist. He knew that honor was a luxury of the living. The dead have no honor. He stepped through the dolmen gate. The meeting took place in the silent orbit of Mars. Guilliman stood on the bridge of the Necron flagship. Sarek sat on a throne that floated on a dais of hard light. The Silent King did not speak verbally. His will was transmitted directly into Guilliman's mind. It was a sensation of cold pressure, like deep water. Darek showed Guilliman the future. He showed him a galaxy without the warp, a galaxy of order, a galaxy where the Chaos Gods starved to death because their food source, the chaotic, emotional, unbridled souls of humanity, had been placed in a stasis field of absolute control. Your father sought the same end, Zarek projected. He sought to calm the sea. I proposed to freeze it. Guilliman argued. He argued for human potential. He argued for the right to evolve. Zarek countered with the image of a Tyranid digestion pool. This is your evolution, the Necron said. To be dissolved. I offer preservation. I offer the museum, not the furnace. Guilliman made the choice. It was the hardest choice of his life. It was the choice to surrender the dream of the Great Crusade to save the reality of the human race. He agreed to the terms. The Imperium would become the pariah protectorate. The strategic chain reaction was immediate and devastatingly efficient. The Necrons did not fight like Astartes. They did not fight like men. They fought like the universe correcting an error. The pylon network was activated. It had been dormant in the geology of 1,000 worlds, hidden for eons. On Mars, the great pylon emerged from the Olympus Mons. On Sotha, the Necrons modified the Pharos. They inverted its frequency. The anti-psychic field expanded. It was the pariah nexus, writ large. It rolled across the galaxy at the speed of light. Where it touched the warp died. The roiling storms of the Imperium were smoothed flat. The connection was severed. For the Tyranids, who relied on the synaptic web of the hive mind, it was a lobotomy. The shadow in the warp that the Tyranids projected was cancelled out by the null field of the Necrons. The lesser bioforms went feral. They lost their coordination. They became mere animals. The combined fleets of the Ultramarines and the Necron dynasties swept through the Ultima Segmentum. Gauss flares vaporized the bioships. Monoliths disintegrated the swarms on the ground. It was a slaughter. The Tyranid threat was broken, not by valor, but by superior physics. But the cost was instant. As the pariah field expanded, humanity felt it. The connection to the soul was dampened. Creativity withered. Passion cooled. The humanity thread of the story snapped into a flat line. On the streets of Macrugga, people stopped singing. They stopped painting. They stopped loving with fire. They simply existed. They worked. They ate. They slept. The crime rate dropped to 0. The suicide rate dropped to 0. Life became a function of biology, not spirit. The final obstacle was terror. The lion still held the Sol system. The Pax Mortis was a rival silence. The Necrons could not tolerate a rival. Sarek and Guilliman moved the fleet to Sol. They did not attack. They simply arrived. 1,000 tomb ships hung over the throne world. The sheer mass of them blocked out the sun. The sky of terror turned twilight green. Guilliman teleported to the inner palace. He walked through the dusty halls. The custodies watched him. They did not attack. They sensed the change. They sensed that the era of the Emperor was truly over. Guilliman reached the stasis vault. He stood before the lion. He initiated the wake-up protocol. The stasis field shimmered and died. The lion gasped. He fell forward, his muscles atrophied, his armor hanging loose on his frame. He looked up. He saw Guilliman. He saw the green light in Guilliman's eyes. Not the light of possession, but the reflection of the Necron technology that now suffused the Lord of Macragge's armor. "Roboute," the lion croaked. The silence. "Is it complete?" "It is," Guilliman said. His voice was flat, devoid of the brotherly warmth he once had. "The war is over, brother. We have won. But the prize is different than we thought." Guilliman explained the pact. He explained the Pariah Protectorate. He expected the lion to rage. He expected the Knight of Caliban to draw his sword and demand death before dishonor. The lion stood up. He walked to the window. He looked at the Necron fleet filling the sky. He looked at the order. He looked at the stillness. He felt the absence of the warp. He felt the absence of the constant, itching pressure of chaos that had haunted him since the forests of Caliban. The lion smiled. It was a terrible, cold smile. "This is what he wanted," the lion whispered. On the training floor, when he spoke of the empty mind, when he spoke of the water that does not ripple, this is the perfection he sought. He just lacked the metal to achieve it. The lion knelt. He pledged his allegiance to the Silent King. The convergence was total. The Imperium of mankind ceased to exist. In its place rose the bimetallic empire of the Sol dynasty. The Space Marines were repurposed. They were no longer the angels of death. They were the immortals. Their gene seed was spliced with necrodermis. They became the enforcement algorithm of the new order. The blood angels, hiding in the halo stars, were hunted down. Their rage, their passion, their red thirst was an aberration in the new silence. They were exterminated to the last man. The tragedy of Sanguinius was erased from history, for history implies a narrative, and the new order had no narrative. It only had data. The human population was reorganized. The hives were optimized. The Necrons cured all diseases. They solved the hunger crisis by synthesizing nutrient paste that provided perfect sustenance. They extended the human lifespan. But they also harvested. Every year, a tithe of the population was taken to the stasis tombs. They were analyzed, disassembled, and used in the Silent King's great experiment to reverse biotransference. Humanity had become a crop, a cherished, protected, well-fed crop. The scribe, a descendant of the boy who planted the seed, sat in his cubicle in the administratum. His name was simply Unit 734. He was healthy. He was safe. There were no wars. There were no demons. The ink on his page never smeared. He wrote the daily report. Productivity, 100%. Deviance, 0%. He looked at the corner of his desk. There was a small glass cube. Inside was the fossilized remains of the seed his ancestor had planted. It had never bloomed. It had turned to stone in the ash. Unit 734 looked at it. He felt a phantom sensation in his chest, a tightness, a desire to break the glass, a desire to scream. The feeling passed. The pariah dampener in the ceiling hummed. The chemicals in his blood regulated his cortisol levels. He went back to writing. He did not break the glass. He did not scream. He continued to work. Deep in the void, far beyond the reach of the Necron pylons, the Chaos Gods screamed. They were starving. The great game was ending. Nurgle's garden withered. Khorne's brass throne rusted. Tzeentch's schemes unraveled into meaningless knots. Slaanesh faded into a whisper. Without the souls of humanity to feed them, they were dissolving into the raw, unthinking energy of the ether. The victory was absolute. The Emperor had won. He had defeated chaos. He had saved humanity from extinction. He had created a galaxy of eternal peace. It was the peace of the mannequin. It was the peace of the insect in amber. The final scene takes place on the surface of Terra. The attendant, Whis, is gone, buried under the rock. But his staff remains. It was blown clear of the explosion. It lies in the ruins of the Eternity Port, half buried in the dust. A Necron canoptek scarab scuttles over it. The machine pauses. It scans the wood. It identifies it as organic waste. It is inefficient. The scarab activates its disassembly beam. The wooden stick is atomized. It vanishes. The last vestige of the lesson is gone. The staff is gone. The flow has stopped. The river has frozen solid. Guilliman stands on the walls of the palace, now reinforced with black stone. He looks at Zarek, who stands beside him. "It is finished," Guilliman says. Zarek nods. "No," Necron replies. "It has just begun. Now we wait for the stars to cool, and in the dark we shall be perfect." The camera pulls back. Terra is a sphere of green light and grey steel. There are no clouds. There are no storms. There is only the grid. The silence stretches out, covering the solar system, covering the sector, covering the galaxy. It is a silence that will last until the heat death of the universe. The what if is answered. If Whis had guided the Emperor would have learned that the only way to win the game is to stop playing. And the only way to stop playing is to stop being human. The 41st millennium arrived without fanfare. There were no bells ringing in the spires of Terra, for bells were deemed an unnecessary expenditure of acoustic energy. There were no parades, for movement without purpose was inefficient. The galaxy had become a perfect sphere of order. The pariah nexus had expanded until it touched the halo stars. The warp was not merely calm, it was petrified. The Imperium had calcified into a solid state, trapping the entities within it like flies in amber. The Chaos Gods were not dead, in the sense that a mortal dies, but they were static. Khorne was a statue of red crystal frozen in the act of screaming. Nurgle was a fossilized garden. Tzeentch was a labyrinth of glass that never changed. Slaanesh was a silhouette of dust. They were museum exhibits, visible only to the Necron sensors that patrolled the membrane of reality. On Terra, the Lord Protector Guilliman sat upon the obsidian throne. He had not moved for 300 years. His biological components had been almost entirely replaced by necrodermis. He did not sleep. He processed data. He watched the harvest yields of the agri-worlds. He monitored the population density of the hive clusters. Every human being in the galaxy was accounted for. Every calorie consumed was tracked. Every death was scheduled. It was the administration he had always dreamed of in Ultramar, carried to its horrific, logical conclusion. Beside him, the lion stood as the sentinel. The first Primarch was a towering figure of black metal and green light. He was the executioner of anomalies. But there were no anomalies. There had not been a crime committed in the Sol system for 4 millennia. Deep in the archives of the Administratum, a servitor unit designated Primus Logos 8 cleaned the floor, This unit retained a fragment of biological memory from its ancestor, the scribe who had once kept a seed in a glass box. The box was still there, sitting on a shelf that had not been dusted in centuries, because dust was eliminated by the atmospheric scrubbers. The seed inside had long since crumbled to grey powder. The glass remained. The servitor paused in its cleaning. A synapse misfired. A random fluctuation in the pariah field, caused by the gravitational pull of a passing rogue moon, created a momentary gap in the dampening field. For 1 second, the servitor felt. It did not feel joy. It did not feel hope. It felt a profound, crushing loneliness. It looked at the grey powder in the box. It remembered that the powder used to be something that could grow. It remembered that growth was messy. It remembered that life required struggle. The servitor opened its mouth. It tried to make a sound. It tried to hum a melody that had been forgotten for 10,000 years. It was the hum of a lullaby. The sound barely left its vocal emitter. It was a tiny, scratching noise in the immense silence of the archive. Immediately, the sensors in the wall turned red. The anomaly was detected. The lion, standing in the throne room miles above, received the alert. Deviance detected in Sector 7G. Acoustic disturbance. Class sentimental. The lion did not hesitate. He did not feel pity. He transmitted a kill code. The servitor collapsed. Its neural link was severed. It fell to the floor, dead. The cleaning unit attached to its arm continued to whir, scrubbing the spot where the body lay, ensuring the fluids did not stain the perfect floor. Guilliman looked at the readout on his internal display. Anomaly corrected, he transmitted to the Silent King, who sat on his throne in the hollow center of Mars. Excellent, the Silent King replied. Entropy is delayed. The galaxy continued to spin. The stars burned with a cold, regulated light. There was no war. There was no pain. There was no laughter. There was only the hum of the machines and the breathing of the crop. The Emperor's dream of a safe humanity had been achieved. He had wished for a species free from the predation of the warp. He had wished for a species that operated with the unity of a single organism. He had gotten exactly what he wanted. In the ruins of the Imperial dungeon, buried under miles of rock and blackstone, there was a small pocket of air that had survived the collapse of the webway gate. In that pocket, darkness was absolute, but if one were to listen closely, with ears not made of metal, one might have heard a faint sound. It was the sound of a wooden staff tapping against a stone floor. Tap, tap, tap. It was a rhythm. It was a heartbeat. It was the attendant, Whis, waiting in the dark. He was not dead. Angels do not die. They merely wait for the next training session. He checked his internal clock. The universe had billions of years left. Eventually, the metal would rust. Eventually, the stars would die. Eventually, the silence would break. And when it did, the lesson would begin again. Until then, the galaxy slept the sleep of the dead, perfect and terrible, a monument to the danger of getting everything you asked for.